I recently debated Matt Dillahunty on the resurrection of Jesus. After this, I've been getting a slew of objections to my opening statement. Some of them are good, some of them are pretty bad. Today, I want to cover one of the more interesting ones. In my opening, I argued for the empty tomb narrative, and this particular objection is against the empty tomb narrative found in Mark 16. I'll present the argument that the skeptic wants to make, then show what the issues are with it. In Mark's gospel, there's a recurring theme that even Jesus' closest companions often fail to understand his true nature. The disciples frequently seem oblivious to his miraculous powers, and they struggle to grasp his teachings and even abandon him when things get tough. Ironically, it's often outsiders who see Jesus for who he really is. For example, take Simon Peter. He boldly says he'll carry the cross of Jesus, that he would die for him, yet when he's faced with persecution, he cowers. He denies even knowing him. It's a stark reversal of expectation when Simon of Cyrene ends up physically carrying Jesus' cross instead. Even at the crucifixion, it's a Roman soldier who is the first to acknowledge Jesus' true identity as the Son of God. Throughout Mark's gospel, there's a strong emphasis on the reversal of expectations, echoing the teachings of Jesus that the first will be the last, the low will be exalted, and the high will be made low. And so, that same motif extends now to Mark 16, where women are the first witnesses to Jesus' empty tomb. It goes against the grain of what you'd expect, just like the rest of the gospel. Instead of the privileged male disciples, it's the marginalized women who discover the empty tomb and go and proclaim the resurrected Christ. Just like it was the Gentiles to first recognize Jesus' divinity. As Richard Carrier states, given Mark's narrative agenda, regardless of the actual facts, having women first at the tomb is exactly what Mark would invent to carry through the gospel message, the least shall be first. Now, this is a really interesting objection, but I think it's got a lot of issues with it. First, I want you to take a step back and kind of just consider from a bird's eye view the dialectical landscape of the empty tomb narratives, specifically Mark 16. Typically, skeptics here want to point out an alleged contradiction. In the other Gospels, women discover the empty tomb of Jesus and return to tell the others. Mark tells us, on the other hand, that the women kept it quiet, at least as far as the original ending goes. Now, for this video, I'm not going to show why this contradiction isn't an actual contradiction or talk about the long ending of Mark and what the original said or any of that. For now, I just want to show an inconsistency and a dilemma that this raises for the skeptic that wants to use this theological/narrative motif approach to the empty tomb narratives as an objection. Well, here's the dilemma. In the first horn, if the women fail to convey the message of the resurrection and instead remain silent due to fear, according to Mark 16:8, it casts them in a negative light. Instead of being shown in a positive light, fearlessly proclaiming the resurrected Jesus, they cower in fear and say nothing, which appears contrary to this idea of the meek and the humble being exalted and the exalted being made low. So here's the point on this first horn. If the skeptic wants to insist there's a contradiction here, well, this actually goes against this other argument they want to make as an objection to the empty tomb narrative. Here's the other horn. If the more plausible interpretation of Mark 16:8 holds true, and the silence of the women is only meant to be temporary on their way back to Galilee, then this is still not casting the women in a reversal role the skeptic wants to insist. The reason why is because the women sure are the first ones to discover the empty tomb, but they're not the ones going out to proclaim the resurrected Jesus still. Instead, they're sort of just passing the torch to the disciples. The women go and tell the male disciples, but the male disciples still get the privilege of seeing the resurrected Jesus and going out to proclaim his resurrection. Given 1 Corinthians 15:5, a tradition Mark certainly would have been familiar with, when writing his gospel, Mark obviously anticipates Peter and the other apostles having a Christophany in Galilee, and that the appearance ended up convincing the 12 of Jesus' divinity and resurrection. So this doesn't fit Mark's overall narrative theme quite nicely. In other words, it ends with the disciples recognizing that Jesus is the Messiah, and that therefore Mark is liberated from this narrative motif that the skeptic so badly wants to insert into the text. So if the skeptic insists on there being a contradiction here, this objection won't work, and they have to give it up. If it's conceded that there's no contradiction, then the case to be made about the invented empty tomb motif is still met with data that severely undercuts it. So which is it? Is it concede there's no contradiction, or are we going to say that we're going to hold to this theory that has very little evidence for it and a lot of evidence against it? You see, there's a lot of issues with this hypothesis. Let's just grant, for sake of explanation, that the skeptic is right, and that Mark continues this theme of misapprehension and misjudgment on the part of the disciples. What doesn't follow from this hypothesis is that Mark would choose women to fill this role still. In fact, Mark could have written in a number of other characters in this invented narrative to make his point if this is what he was trying to do. While Jewish women were certainly not equal with their male counterparts, there's a number of greater candidates that Mark could have used for this. Imagine this scenario. Simon of Cyrene, accompanied by his sons Alexander and Rufus, witnessed the Roman soldiers removing the cross from his back and then nailing Jesus onto it. Unable to take their eyes away from the gruesome sight, the trio remains among the crowd as Jesus breathes his last breath and Joseph takes his body down, laying it in a nearby tomb. As the Sabbath passes, rumors and gossip about the execution of this revered rabbi and messianic figure swirl through the streets, piquing Simon's curiosity. He and his sons decide to pay the respects at the tomb, only to find it empty. From there, the events unfold as history tells us. In this version of the narrative, the Gentiles fulfill this motif role. Just like in Mark's Gospel, the Gentiles are the ones that see Jesus for who he is, while the disciples completely misunderstand who he is time and time again, so too now we have the Gentiles discovering the empty tomb out of paying respects for Jesus. If Mark's literary intentions here were to invent the empty tomb narrative to fulfill this motif, this is just one example of how he could have done it without including women. Mark's options don't end there. If he wanted to invent the account to satisfy this literary motif, Mark could have had a Roman soldier, perhaps even the same one who recognized Jesus' true identity in Mark 15:39, to visit the tomb on Sunday morning to express his newfound conviction and conversion. That would certainly counter expectations. We also have a number of deaf, blind, paralytic, lepers, deaf, mute people that Jesus healed that could have easily fit this motif as well. All of these same people would have surely wanted to come and pay their respects to Jesus, the man who healed them after all. It's not hard to imagine the crippled man in Mark 2:1-12 holding on to his faith in Jesus despite everyone else in Jerusalem rejecting him as a failed Messiah. He with his friends could have been heartbroken to see Jesus crucified, and eager to mourn and honor the great teacher at his burial site. Given Jesus' teaching of how the poor and the meek will be first in the kingdom of heaven, it makes sense that you would have people like this coming to see the resurrected Christ in the empty tomb. Here's the point. While women were low in the caste system of ancient Jewish culture, nothing about that necessitates that it be them discovering the empty tomb, and that Mark would specifically invent an empty tomb narrative with women when there's so many better options. And the reason why is because there's nothing that stops a poor, sick, or middle-class man from giving testimony, so long he is 1, not a slave, 2, does not have a dishonest occupation, 3, is not a direct family member of the accused, and 4, is physically able and mentally competent to witness an event and verbally give testimony. Even the discernment of a sick, impoverished, or Gentile individual was still considered better than that of a woman. The skeptic here then wants to say that Mark's intention was to fulfill this literary motif and provide an apologetic for the empty tomb. But given the considerations we just saw, it doesn't make sense to provide an apologetic of women fulfilling this empty tomb and fulfilling this first will be the last motif. If Mark's primary concern was apologetics rather than conveying accurate history, this would not be the move he's trying to make. Even if Mark wants to fulfill this first will be the last motif, there's still better options on the table for Mark. Now, one anticipated objection to what I'm saying here is that women traditionally performed the burial rites. But this depends on a misunderstanding of Jewish funerary practices and the role of gender within the ceremonial elements of burial and mourning. It's true that a female corpse was typically buried by females, besides the fact that a husband could sometimes bury his wife. Semitic law states that a male corpse can be devised for its funeral by either gender. In the early Talmudic tractate, we encounter the following law without a commentary. A man may shroud and gird the corpse of a man, but not that of a woman. A woman may shroud and gird the corpse of a man or of a woman. In fact, it was even customary for Jewish men to be buried by his sons. There's countless examples in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament where a man's corpse is buried by other men. For example, Abraham is buried by his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac is buried by Jacob and Esau. Jacob is buried by his sons and by his people. The Gospels mention that it was the son's role to bury his deceased father. John the Baptist is buried by his disciples, which were very likely men. Stephen is buried by godly men after his martyrdom. Furthermore, in the Gospels, it's Joseph of Arimathea preparing the body for burial, not women. The Gospels record the women viewing this from a distance, but in no way imply that the women tried to assist here. So if the Gospels had no issue presenting Jesus as being primarily entombed by a Sanhedrin member, and Jewish law and tradition shows precedence for men taking active roles in funerary customs, then there's no real reason why an invented narrative would necessarily include women as the sole witnesses to the empty tomb. Not to mention that there would have been better options for Mark if he indeed even wanted to invent this narrative. It's for these reasons that critical scholars see the inclusion of women at the empty tomb narratives as one of the strongest evidential chips in favor for the authenticity of this pericope. For example, the German scholar Raymond Schweger claims that the majority of the New Testament historians usually give a positive assessment to the aspect of women finding the tomb empty on Sunday morning, and therefore regard it as genuine. And even non-Christian scholars who have historically been against Christianity and critics of Christianity say the same thing. Take the words of the late prominent atheist Christopher Hitchens, admitting that the witness of the women at the empty tomb is remarkable for that time period. Although he does deny the historicity of the resurrection account, he states, "What religion that wants its fabrication to be believed is going to say, 'You've got to believe it, because we have some illiterate, hysterical girls who said they saw this.'" But when you assess the data from both sides, one side being that this is a historical account, and the other that Mark invented this motif to serve some literary purpose and apologetic purpose, the data supports the authenticity of this account.